So then, well, let's start. Well, because we are a little bit late, I will make this introduction as short as possible. I'm very happy, of course, that Reinhard accepted to join the lecture series today, and I'm very happy that he is by giving a talk on his latest book. He has recently, or what this year, published a book on the so-called truthful comfort women in Japan, and the talk is well will be of course about the book is kind of event that we will have more often in the future, that people are, well, if they have published a book, that they have here in this lecture the possibility to present their publications. So Reinhard studied history and Latin in Kiel and Japanese studies in Hamburg and Tokyo. In 2082, he got his PhD, and 5 years later, he was habilitated, so got wrote a second book, completed a second book, and what is in German called Habilitation. And so in 1997, he was formally given the title of, in German we call it Privatdozent, and but afterwards, a lot of professorships followed, one in Halle-Wittenberg, in Erfurt, Michigan, and last but not least, since 2008. While he is a specialist, of course, in Japanese and East Asian studies, in East Asian history, and has published a lot of books, especially introductions into the Japanese history, into the relationship between the Korean and the Japanese societies, and very, very valuable introduction into the history of East Asia. So Reinhard, we're happy that you are here, and well, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Stefan, for the kind introduction. And so my topic for today is truth, affect, and difference, which is a combination of two terms being introduced by Michel Foucault, who talked of truth, affects in the context of his theory of discourse. And the other term, differend, was coined by Jean-François Lyotard. So it's another French philosopher debating discourse and discourse analysis. And I won't go very much into details why I chose these terms for my presentation, but you will hopefully be able to discuss this afterwards in the Q&A section, I hope. So the important thing for today is my subtitle, actually, The Comfort Women and Their Monuments. And my presentation will consist of 8 chapters, which are a kind of topography of the discourse about the so-called comfort women. And this whole presentation is based on a new book which I wrote and which has appeared just last week. So it's actually brand new. I myself don't have a hard copy of the book yet. It's still, just out of print. Okay, so let me start with a short outline of the discourse history, or the main developments I consider to be relevant for the discourses about the comfort women. And actually, you can see it's a fairly long timeline. I myself have been dealing with this issue, which puts considerable stress on the relations of Japan with not only Korea, but also other countries in the world, around the world. So I have been dealing with this for almost 30 years now. But as you can see in this timeline, actually the discourse dates way back into the 1930s. So in my analysis, there are a number of turning points, or let's say important steps, which mark chapters in this kind of discourse history. So one would be, of course, the Second World War in itself, which in East Asia lasted from 1937 to 1945, and which is intrinsically linked to the whole problem of the comfort woman, obviously. Then we have the post-war history from 1945, and in 1965 we reach another milestone, which is the conclusion of the Japanese-Korean basic treaty, as they call it. It's basically the restoration of diplomatic relations between the two countries of Japan and South Korea. And then in the 1970s and early 80s, the debate took place mostly in Japan. And after that, in 1990, everything changed again when the Korean women's movement took over and started their movement against, or for the rehabilitation of the so-called comfort women. And from then on, the discourse has multiplied, and we reach another milestone in 2011 when the first the first Korean comfort woman statue was erected in Seoul, which has since then, so for a span of 10 years now, become the object of fierce debate between different factions in this discourse. Okay, so having said that, let me first try to give an overview about the possible or the complexity actually of the dimensions and aspects of the comfort woman discourse. From the standpoint of today, we can basically break down the field to I think these five main topics or aspects. One, of course, colonialism. Second, racism. Third, sexism. Fourth, capitalism. And fifth, militarism, which are or may be interconnected in different ways, but I won't discuss this today. However, all of these main fields do have sub-themes, subtopics. For instance, the problem of colonialism could also be seen as a problem of center versus periphery in broader terms than just colony and so-called motherland. Racism, of course, could also be claimed to be nationalism, but you could also judge nationalism very differently than just labeling it as racism, of course. Well, sexism leads us into the whole problem of an issues of prostitution on the one hand and so-called sex slavery on the other hand. And I will talk about this in greater detail afterwards. Now then, if you think of modern society as being shaped, or the modern world as being shaped predominantly by the capitalistic economic mode, then of course capitalism becomes a very necessary, or the understanding of capitalism becomes a very necessary tool of understanding also the comfort woman issue, particularly when you break it down to topics such as poverty and expropriation. And then lastly, militarism plays a part in it, of course, as I said before. The whole story develops during the Second World War, and it is also connected to the general questions of violence. Obviously, violence of man against women, but not only that. Okay, so this is kind of, well, visualization of where we can actually branch in this debate, and then mostly everything has been discussed already. I'm also understanding the whole debate as being divided into different narratives, and I discern four major narratives. First, we have a narrative that is born and formulated and very influential still today in Korea, mainly South Korea, and it was led by a Korean movement which called itself, or used to call itself until 3 years ago, in Korean is Chongdaehyok. I'll talk about this later. Chongdaehyok means basically, or is translated into English as Korean Council for the or against sexual slavery among the Japanese colonial system, something like that. Anyway, Korean Council is the short name for it in English, usually. I prefer using the Korean term because the Korean term itself is not impartial. It is biased towards a certain interpretation of the issue, which is problematic, and I'll refer to this afterwards. So the next narrative, powerful narrative, would be the purely feminist narrative. I rather call it purely feminist, because it does not rely, as does the Chongdaehyok narrative, on nationalist ideas. So the Chongdaehyok narrative is very intensively interwoven with South Korean nationalism, which is not the case with the purely feminist narrative, that, on the contrary, criticizes nationalistic interpretations of the problem, and draws very different lines. So for their perspective, topics like patriarchalism and collectivism are much more the focus of what they are looking at. The next narrative is not so influential, actually, but I think it's rather important, and I like to call it the socioeconomic narrative, which is linked to an analysis of modern capitalism, and looks into problems that would transcend purely national points of view, of course, because it looks at trends like globalization and the links between the global world order and the suppression of minorities, not only women or comfort women in this particular case. And then we have a last narrative, which is predominant in Japan, and it has become a driving force in conservative Japanese politics, which is usually called the revisionist narrative. So it's a narrative that is fiercely fighting against and objecting the interpretations that have been put forward by all the other narratives. So yes, it's also about nationalism. In this part, about Japanese nationalism, and it's also about collectivism, but I'll deal with this afterwards. Okay, so these are the main narratives, and I'll then try to explain how they came into life in chronological order. So the first place we should consider in this discourse history is the city of Nagasaki, actually, because well, I will talk about it because in an instant, but let me first introduce a quotation by Partha Chatterjee, who said that, and this is very important for my discussion, the imperial prerogative is the power to declare the colonial exception. And I'll explain this immediately. Now, what happened in Nagasaki, which in February 1936, the Nagasaki District Court convicted 10 Japanese, among them 2 women, for having abducted 15 women from the Nagasaki region to a military so-called comfort station in Shanghai, China. And this verdict was confirmed by both the regional court and the Supreme Court of Japan in March 1937. So what had happened? A group of people, men and women, had, as the verdict concludes, abducted, which meant recruited and misled 15 women from Japan, and they had been sent to Shanghai to work in a so-called military comfort station, which is nothing but a military brothel, which was actually installed in 1932, and so the whole incident had taken place in 1932. But 4 years later, these women, these 15 women, well, they indicted the people responsible for this and had them convicted to imprisonment. Now, this is a very important case in this whole issue because it's the only case that has ever been brought to criminal court in Japan as for the comfort women. So there is no other case. And the only case, therefore, is quite interesting because it leaves no doubt. It leaves no doubt that what these, well, you can call them pimps, had done to the women was illegal. So this discussion or this judgment was, of course, based on law. Because in 1925, Japan had joined the International Convention for the Suppression of the White Slave Traffic. Actually, this is the English, this convention goes with this English title, which is not quite the official title, but I'll explain this. So the International Convention was concluded in 1910 or promulgated in 1910. And the main content is as follows. So whoever, in order to gratify the passions of another person, has procured, enticed, or led away, even with her consent, a woman or girl under age for immoral purposes shall be punished, notwithstanding that the various acts constituting the offense may have been committed in different countries. And second, whoever, in order to gratify the passions of another person, has by fraud or by means of violence, threats, abuse of authority, or any other method of compulsion, procured, enticed, or led away a woman or girl over age for immoral purposes, shall also be punished. So the thing is, the prostitution of underage girls was completely forbidden, punishable, and as for adults, it was prohibited if they were led into this by fraud, or means of violence, threats, and so on. Okay, so this sounds pretty impressive, right? So, like some very strong convention against slave or female slave traffic, or the enforced prostitution, as the legal term is, enforced prostitution. And actually, Japan joined this in 1925. But there's a big but, and that's it. Almost all colonial powers at that time, including Japan, didn't apply this convention to their colonies. So the women and girls living in the colonial territories were exempted from this rule, from this convention. It was possible legally to trade there. And this is why this convention goes under the English name of White Slave Traffic Convention, because it did only apply to white women. And interestingly, Japanese women were counted as white women. And this is not just a theoretical statement, but very practical. For instance, in the Dutch Netherlands, the officials kept statistics on the number of women living there. And in this case, the Japanese women were categorized as white women. White women is not a category based on the color of skin, but on the legal status of the women concerned. So this is the colonial exception, right? Human rights, in this case, the rights of women against enforced prostitution were limited to women not subjects in colonial, or not subjected to colonial rule. Now this was a quite important differentiation because the verdict of the Japanese courts in 1936, 1937 did only apply to Japan properly, not to the Japanese colonies, which meant that during the next years, the Japanese military recruited women from the colonies or living in the colonies, also Japanese living in Korea, were not subjected to this convention. But anyway, most of the women forced into the comfort women system were women from the colonies. So from Korea, the biggest number from Korea, and also considerable numbers from Taiwan and China, and afterwards from the Southeast Asian parts of the war zone that Japan occupied in the course of the war. Which means that there was a group in the beginning of Japanese women recruited as comfort women, but around 1938, they were gradually replaced by women from the colonies because of this judgment. But still, there were also Japanese women serving as comfort women. But this is a clear indication of how colonialism, might also call it imperialism, affected the mechanism of recruitment of comfort women. You could also say racism. Okay. So our next chapter takes place in 1944, in the summer of 1944, in a town called Myitkyina in what was then Burma, so Myanmar nowadays, and this place is near the Chinese-Burmese border, and this had some strategic importance for both the Japanese and the Allies. So the Allies, the Americans and their British and other allies started attacking this town in the summer of 1944. And after some fierce fighting, well, they captured the city, the town, and they made many prisoners of war. Amongst them were a number of women who identified as comfort women. Almost all of them were Koreans. So the Americans started interrogating them. And you can see here the first group of comfort women captured by the US Army in August 1944, being interrogated by young American GIs. And as you can see from their looks, they were almost invariably Asian man or man of Asian descent. The one to the left, kneeling here and to the left, actually was American Chinese, and the others were American Japanese. So the whole interviews were done in the Japanese language because nobody at that time was prepared to meet Koreans and speak Korean with them. So while giving these restrictions, the interviews were repeated in a different camp, and we have reports on what the women told the American soldiers and how the Americans, or what the Americans made of this. And many of the Americans stated that they were shocked by seeing these young girls. Their average age was, in this case, 23, the youngest being 17, I think, and the oldest 30, 31, 32, something like that. So the median was around 23 years. And so they tried to understand what had been happening to these women. In this case, they also captured the couple, the couple that was running the military brothel. They were both Japanese nationals living in Korea, however, so they were fluent in Korean, and actually, quite ironically, they were translating most of the interrogations for the American soldiers from Japanese to Korean and vice versa. So they understood that this group of women had been recruited by the brothel owner in Korea, and they had been promised to work in Singapore or some fancy place and to get paid, and after being able to repay the advancement payment, the advance payment their families had been given, would be allowed to return to their homes and quit. Actually, this was they were recruited in 1943, and when they fell into the hands of the Americans, no one of the whole group had been able to return to Korea. Actually, so anyway, the Americans captured different groups of such comfort women, or they called them comfort girls, and they were able to draw a quite clear picture, an again, quite thorough understanding of how the system worked. And they started to gather this information in reports. For what reason exactly is not really understood, but maybe they had in mind to use this information against the Japanese after the war for some kind of, penal treatment, whatever. Anyway, as a matter of fact, as the Japanese army in the last days of the Second World War burned most of the compromising documents, the sources relating to the comfort women issue mostly come from this American effort to gather information during the last months of the war. So, for instance, this so-called comfort women contract, actually it's a contract specimen, was included in a pile of sources translated from Japanese sources into English in 1945 or early 1945, and this was distributed among responsible American officers, and got into, well, it fell into obliteration until the 1990s, when it was rediscovered and republished. But actually, this slip of paper, this so-called contract, is quite important for the whole debate, because the revisionist narrative points out that many of the women and also the brothel owners claimed that the women had been given contracts, and so they signed up for being comfort women. Well, until today, not a single of these contracts has been found. Not a single contract. We only have this kind of specimen. And if you look carefully at the contents, it's actually not a contract to to become a comfort woman, but rather some kind of agreement to work under the regulations and instructions of the Japanese army, without determining anything about the contents of their duties, and things like payment and so on. So this is all we know about contracts in a legal sense. We know that women were either forced to sign these slips, these contracts, or that they voluntarily signed them. What we don't know is what was the contractual base between these women and the brothel owners, or the pimps. And the prisoners of war who told their stories to the Americans insisted on the fact that the women were paid, and they also gave some, indication of how much they received and things like that. But much of this is disputed and not very clear. By the way, there were also comfort women which were not recruited in an orderly way and did not receive any payment. That's also quite clear. But anyway, we also have evidence from the Japanese, or let's say the colonial side. For instance, there's we know of a number of advertisements, recruitment ads in Korean newspapers. This one was published in October 1944. And this is calling for comfort women to be supplied to the Japanese troops, and people who wanted to provide the army with such women should come to such and such office, not of the Japanese army, but the context quite clear. It was recruitment for the military. That's clear. But the interesting thing is this is written in Korean, and of course almost none of the Korean comfort women at that time could read or write Korean. So most of them were illiterate. We know for sure that these recruitment ads were not directed towards Korean women or Korean prostitutes, but to men or women acting as recruiters, Korean recruiters. Okay, so this shows that the Japanese army relied to a big degree on the cooperation or collaboration of local people who would then recruit Korean women and bring them to the to the Japanese army. I said that we don't know exactly why the Americans gathered all this information, but we know for sure that they used it in a specific way as a tool for psychological operation or psychological warfare. So what we can see here is a leaflet that was published by the American Army, printed by the American Army early in 1945. The text is Japanese, and it's the story of it's supposed to be the letter of a Japanese comfort woman from the Nagasaki area to her mother back in Japan. And the story is that she was seduced or misled to be recruited as a comfort woman and was sent to China, and was bitterly disappointed by the behavior of the Japanese army. And she was full of regret, and she wanted to let her mother know at least that she was alive. So that's the story. And according to the letter, she found a Japanese man who was willing to bring this letter back to Japan and inform her mother, which he did not do because he found out that her mother had already died. So he handed this letter to a clandestine organization, former Japanese soldiers who were fighting against Japan on the side of the Chinese communists. So that's the story. But as you can imagine, this is a fake, right? The Americans made this up in the hope of instilling doubt and distrust among the Japanese soldiers, and not for the purpose of aiding the Korean women, right, or the comfort women, in this case, Japanese comfort women. But, yes, of course, you can use the whole issue in different ways. So after the war, when the war was over, the question was what to make of this story. And in 1946, the next round of criminal cases or penal cases took place actually under the command of the Dutch army. So they were the only allied force that actually took action against the Japanese army um, um, on behalf of the comfort women issue. So when the Dutch army returned to Indonesia in 1946, they started a series of martial courts, and two of them actually dealt with the comfort women issue. In one case, in Batavia in 1946, a Japanese comfort station owner was convicted to 15 years of imprisonment for enforced prostitution. That's the legal term, which was derived from the Anti-Slave Convention of 1910, of white women. There was no questioning about the prostitution or enforced prostitution of Asian women, which was, of course, well known to the Dutch that it had taken place, but this was not part of the judgment because, of course, the convention protected only white women, right? So he was convicted to prison, and also his Dutch consort, a woman who was very brutally abusing the women concerned in this case. The important thing is that the owner of the brothel, the man, claimed that he did not know how his consort, how the Dutch woman abused and threatened the white woman, the comfort woman, and he said he didn't know anything about this. Now the court said that this did not matter at all, because he, as the responsible owner of the brothel, was also responsible for everything his collaborators did. So they convicted him in spite of his claiming not knowing about such threats and abuse. And the court also explicitly stated that it did not matter at all whether these women were working as comfort women voluntarily by their own free will or not. So they came to the conclusion that this was a clear case of enforced prostitution, regardless of whether the woman had volunteered or not. Now, 2 years later, in a place called Semarang, the court martial, the martial court, convicted a group of Japanese army officers, and one of them was actually executed, and civil employees of the army, for the abduction of white women. Once again, abduction and also rape. In this case, however, the court came to the conclusion that they very much doubted that these women had been volunteering, but they also said this was not accounted for in the judgment. So voluntarily or not, these women were protected by the convention, yes, of course, but the aspect of voluntariness did not play a part in handing the verdict. So very similar cases, but different conclusions. This is quite important for the legal assessment of the whole issue. Now, late in late 1945, when the war was over, the Japanese and their collaborators were forced to leave China, the occupied parts of China, of course, and they left very quickly. But hundreds of comfort women were left behind in China, actually. And interestingly, a group of them, several hundred Korean women, organized themselves and demanded publicly to be repatriated to Korea. And they also demand to be, well, let's say, re-educated, to be able, as they verbally said, to be able to become healthy elements, healthy members of society after their return. So they wanted to quit prostitution, basically. They prepared a list of their members, so several hundred, including some children, which were, of course, their own children. And somehow, many of them seem to have managed to get back to Korea, and also the list of the women. And what we can see here is an article from a Korean newspaper from the summer of 1946, which mentions these women. The lead line is "Saving the Comfort Woman," and also tells the names of the women who were leading this kind of self-help organization. Now the tragedy is that this whole story and the list of the women concerned was lost or forgotten for the next 56 years. No one in Korea ever discussed this before 2002, when this list of the women was actually discovered in the National Independence Monument archives. So the list had been there for all the time, but nobody had ever looked at it. Tragically, these women and their astonishing agency to organize themselves and to find a way back to Korea was completely absent from the whole discourse. Even today, almost no one in Korea knows about these women. Meanwhile, in Japan after the war, there were mixed ways of dealing with the past. And what is important for our context is that actually the first monument for the commemoration of the comfort women ever erected was erected in 1986 in a place called Tateyama, which is quite near to Tokyo, actually. And it has never been widely discussed in Japan nor in Korea, even though many of the people involved in the comfort women movement must have known its existence. Now, the Japanese discussion of the comfort woman issue was at first anecdotal and not let's say working towards recompensation or rehabilitation or anything like that. So the comfort women were remembered by veterans who said, well, yes, they were quite an important part of our daily lives. There were even some movies which mentioned them, or even, well, in two or three movies, they played quite a big part. But nobody ever considered this to be a problem, or a issue concerning the Japanese past, or the need for reconciliation, or whatever. This changed, however, when in the 1970s, Japan recovered economically, and Japanese businessmen expanded their activities to other parts of the world, and particularly to Korea, South Korea. So after the 1965 basic treaty between Japan and South Korea, South Korea depended heavily on economic cooperation with Japan. And the Japanese businessmen, well, they took advantage of this, and of course they they traveled to South Korea, and in sort of concerted action between their employers and the South Korean government and the South Korean entertainment industry, they were provided with access to South Korean prostitutes, meaning thousands of South Korean girls were once again abducted and forced into prostitution and made available to Japanese men. So this gradually became known in Japan, and women's organizations started protesting this, what they called kiseng tourism. Kiseng is the Korean name for geisha. So particularly Christian movements, Christian women's movements, started taking up this topic and discussing it in conferences. And there was one woman, a journalist called Matsui Yayori, who started to act against this kiseng tourism. And in an article which she published in Japanese in 1974, she mentioned that she had been made aware by Korean Christian women of the problem. And particularly, if you look at the end of this quotation, we wish to call your attention to the shameful fact that many Japanese tourists are making Korean women into sexual slaves. For her, for Matsui, this was a revelation, because she compared this from her own personal historical memory to the comfort woman issue. So it seems that the Korean women themselves did not raise this point at first, but they, the Japanese women understood, and also the men, willing to listen to them, understood that this was a kind of continuation of what had been going on during the war. So for the first time in the discourse, the term sexual slave or sexual slavery was employed. Actually, the whole article written by Matsui Yayori, and translated into English in 1977, was called Sexual Slavery in Korea. And Matsui herself based her historical judgment on a book which had been published by a Japanese male journalist 1 year before that, in 1973, which was called Comfort Woman, or Military Comfort Woman, and which was a non-fiction book or report based on interviews he had with former Japanese soldiers and military physicians, things like that. So it wasn't based on interviews with former comfort women, but it was kind of an eye opener for many people in Japan, who for the first time try to make sense of all these scattered memories of the comfort woman, and how this was part of Japanese imperialism as a whole, or colonialism. Now, this discussion had some impact on groups which were working towards Korean-Japanese reconciliation. However, they didn't have much public impact. It was only in 1989-1990 that our story took another turn, when a group of Korean women organized lectures, once again, most of them coming from Christian women's movements, and they described the fate of the comfort women, well, yes, as barbaric acts of sexual enslavement. And the Japanese who heard these stories were quite shocked and started trying to collect evidence and help them bring forward this issue to the Japanese public and also to the Japanese courts. So they started preparing legal suits against the Japanese government for the abuse of Korean women. Okay, the thing is that the Korean women, or the feminists leading the Korean women's movement, did not think that the Japanese victims of this comfort women system were worthy of being included in this whole movement, because they claimed that the Japanese comfort women had been professional prostitutes, most of them, as they thought. So they should be excluded from the movement. And they decided to link the issue of the comfort women to the issue of Korean nationalism. And that's the point where the whole movement split up. So from 1919 on, you have this narrative of the so-called Chongdaehyop, so the Association for Redressment for the comfort women, which was led by the Koreans and which was heavily centered on linking Korean nationalism and the question of the comfort women. And you have Japanese activists who said, no, this is unfair. There were also Japanese victims. Well, for one, the monument in Tateyama is witness to that, because it was inspired by the revelations of Japanese women, and who therefore parted ways with the Korean movement. If you look at the rationale of the Korean movement, one of the early leaders, Lee Hyo-jae, in 1999, obviously linked these issues of comfort women and nationalism when she used the phrase, "It's a national disgrace that the Korean women's movement is raising this issue only today." The important thing is the term national disgrace, right? She appealed to Korean nationalism And then the next thing is, if you do this, if you decide that this is a question of Japanese versus Korean nationalism, then of course it's impossible to put any blame on the Korean side, right? So the people who are responsible for recruitment and supporting the Japanese in recruiting Korean women were not mentioned at all. Nobody in Korea has ever been put to trial for recruiting Korean women. The story became very straightforward and very simple. The Japanese had to take all of the blame. In 1990, after the Korean women and their Japanese friends had started preparing legal trials, the first Korean victim of the comfort woman system came forward, stepped forward, and had a TV interview in which she told her story. She was called Kim Hak-sun, and she became a pioneer for the public discussion because she was the first one to show her face and to show her real name and say, yes, I was part of the system. I was a comfort woman. After this happened, a number of Koreans and also other nationalities identified themselves, and their witnesses. They were considered witnesses in this course, and their statements were recorded and published. Not all of them, not because this is also in the very early stages of so-called oral history. It's kind of tricky to deal with these early statements. They have been revisioned. They have been, let's say, scrutinized afterwards. But at that time, they were, frankly, quite naively recorded, and this also is part of the problem because not all of the statements are free from errors and flaws, which has been exploited by the revisionists because they say they lied. Okay, these women lied, or many of them lied, which is not the case. But this is a methodological problem. Now, the whole issue got a new impetus when the Korean movement approached the United Nations, and particularly when in 1996 the special rapporteur for the rights of women, Radhika Kumaraswamy, wrote a report about the comfort women issue, which put the blame on the Japanese government and which explicitly demanded a redress for the women concerned, and these women were called sexual slaves. Okay, so from this time on, from 1996 on, the term sexual slaves or sexual slavery had become an official UN-sanctioned term to describe what the Japanese had done, much to the regret and also objection of the Japanese, who until today have not accepted this term. So they flatly deny that this was sexual slavery. However, a couple of definitions have been provided to underline this labeling. For instance, Kelly D. Eskin writes that the term slavery is appropriately invoked when victims effectively lose all or partial ownership of their own bodies, being treated as the personal property of the perpetrators or other culpable parties. And applied to our problem, it is important to stress that not all victims were virgins or young girls, and some victims had previously been prostitutes before being subjected to sexual slavery. As increasingly recognized in progressive societies, prostitutes can be raped, and when this occurs, they should be treated no differently than other rape victims. Voluntary prostitutes should not be confused with the women and girls forced into sexual slavery to the Japanese military, which runs counter the Zhongli official narrative, because the official narrative, official Korean narrative, stresses pretty much that the women they are caring about were forced into prostitution, that they were virgins, that they were young girls, and not in any way volunteering. Whereas this approach, which is a much more feminist approach, so it's part of the second feminist narrative, stresses that it does not matter at all whether you volunteer or not in this system. Well, of course, you can extend this discussion, which is for Eskin was centered around the question of comfort women, to a general discussion of whether prostitution in general forms a kind of sexual slavery or not. And for instance, Caroline Norma has done this in 2016. She published a book which claimed explicitly that all kinds of prostitution constitute some form of sexual slavery. And you will know that this is a highly disputed point among feminists. Anyway, these are the ramifications of the international discussion. Of course, there are also bilateral Japanese Korean discussions still going on. For instance, about the monuments, the monuments commemorating the comfort women. This monument, which is nowadays the most famous monument, was erected in 2011 in the vicinity of the Embassy of Japan in Seoul, and it's called Statue of Peace of a Young Girl, mostly short to maiden or girl statue or comfort woman statue. The Koreans are pretty in love with this statue as much as the Japanese hate it. Since 2011, replicas of this statue and other forms of the statue have been erected around the world, also in Germany, in the US, in Australia, China, and so on. Each time they caused a huge controversy and attracted, the hatred of the Japanese living there, and it's very very controversial statue. But the main point I want to raise about this statue is it depicts, according to the sculptures themselves, it depicts a 14 to 15-year-old girl. And she is considered to be some kind of model victim. Well, the model victim in the model Korean narrative is a young virgin. Yes, of course. But that's not historical truth, right? We know from all available sources that this is far from historical reality, which does not prevent us from accepting that this statue might be some point of commemoration. But I just want to say that it's problematic to identify or to imagine the typical Korean comfort woman, or any comfort woman, in this way. And then, of course, in May last year, we had another shocking development when Lee Young-soo, who was 91 at the time and had been active in the comfort woman movement for more than 30 years, held a press conference in which she told that he did not support the official Korean movement any further because she felt abused and exploited by the movement, and she explicitly rejected to be called sex slave anymore because she said it makes her feel dirty and embarrassed. And this is, of course, from the point of view of discourse, this is a highly important statement, because if people don't want to be called in such and such a way, you should not call them like that, right? So what next? What's the next step? What is the alternative to call these women sexual slaves? Frankly, I don't have an answer. That's why I'm, for the time being, sticking to comfort women and not calling them sexual slaves. But of course, this is open for debate and should be debated from now on. Okay, so far, thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.